Good evening, everyone. I'm Kat Mueller, educator of adult programs here at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. Thank you all so much for attending tonight's talk connected to our featured exhibition, Napoleon, Power and Splendor, on view through March 10th, so you have plenty of time to see it if you haven't yet. I also want to recognize the Missouri Humanities Council for their support of our speaker series. Some of you did receive comment cards as you walked in today. For those of you who received one, at the end of today's program before you leave, please take a couple minutes to fill it out. We're asking for your candid feedback on the program. As a thank you for your time, we'll also be raffling off a $50 Visa gift card. If you'd like to participate in the raffle, please leave your name and contact info at the top of the comment card, and we'll contact the winner sometime next week. We can either mail it or it can be picked up here at the museum. Please drop the clipboard, comment card at the tables as you exit, or feel free to leave it in your seat for me to collect afterwards. Thank you. And at the end of this evening's talk, we will have some time for questions. We're utilizing live captioning tonight in an effort to make the museum and our programs more accessible for all. If you have a question at the conclusion of the talk, I will ask you to raise your hand and I'll come to you with a mic so that everyone can hear you clearly and the captioner can also hear your question. I'm excited to introduce you tonight to the speaker, Aimee Marcereau DeGalan. She joined the Nelson-Atkins Museum in the fall of 2016 as the Louis L. and Adelaide C. Ward Senior Curator of European Arts. A specialist in British and French 18th and 19th century art, she manages the department, which has oversight over collections ranging from ancient art to post-impressionism. Aimee's first project at the Nelson was the installation of the block collection of impressionist and post-impressionist art. During her tenure, she has augmented the collection with 9 new works of art and helped secure the recent gift of the beautiful Rachel Royce still life donated by the Moffat family. Presently, she is serving as the in-house curator for Napoleon, Power and Splendor. She is also working on several of her own exhibition projects, one that explores the creative relationships between 19th century French artist Armand Guillaumin and his circle of friends, including Cézanne and Van Gogh, and another around the doubly dangerous pursuit of beauty in 18th century England. In this evening's talk, Napoleon Fashioning an Empire, Aimee will discuss how Napoleon harnessed fashion not only to bolster French economy, but also to legitimize his reign. During the Napoleonic era, the clothing of men, women, and children acquired a social, cultural, and economic importance that it never had before in the history of the Western world. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Aimee Marcereau DeGalan.
Thank you, Kat, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out. So you might notice that I have a slight addendum to my title. It's not only Napoleon fashioning an empire, but it's or how an ex-priest, an ex-hairdresser, and a Corsican immigrant led the empire of fashion. It sounds like it's the start of one of those bad jokes. I promise you it's not. So first, the Corsican, and a little bit of background. So as many of you know, Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica in 1769, and that island had become part of France just a year before, in 1768. So he grew up not knowing French culture, not knowing the language, not knowing anything about it. And so really when he came to power in France, he was kind of an outsider. His parents were Carlo Maria de Bonaparte and his mom, Maria Letizia Bonaparte. You'll see a lot of portraits in the exhibition downstairs where the cousins and the nieces all have that name Letizia, that is from his mother. They like to continue on the family names in the household. So Carlo was very strategic in his raising of his family. There were 13 kids, 8 of whom survived infancy. And because Corsica was in a moment of transition before it was overseen by France, in this kind of interim period of government, it was headed up by a gentleman on the left, Pasquale Paoli, who was the leader of this independent Corsican republic. And Carlo, having a big family and knowing that he needed to secure his family's future, he sort of sided up to Paoli and served as his personal assistant. When it became clear that France was taking over Corsica in 1769, Carlo was swift to switch allegiance and alliances and became an assistant to Louis XVI. So it was really interesting to sort of see that power brokerage that went on at that moment, but it was really all in an effort for Carlo's big family, including Napoleon himself. Because France wasn't directly in Corsica, Carlo kind of spun a tale, and he claimed that he was from an old bourgeois family in France, and that was enough to get young Napoleon into a very prestigious military school free of charge. So it was this kind of fictive beginning that started Napoleon off on his way to what we obviously now know his path as an emperor. But it's a really interesting path considering that he was a completely self-made man, and that's really going to have an impact on how hard he tries to show his image and hit you over the top with these symbols, with everything has an inherent meaning, and that's really going to be kind of the focus of the talk that I'm going to give tonight. So as I said, Napoleon was a self-made man. He's following on the heels of 200 years of a Bourbon dynasty. So we have Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, who of course reigned up until the Revolution. And it was a court that was, as I said, 200 years in the making. Louis and the whole Bourbon dynasty had a set group of symbols. We think of the fleur-de-lis. We see that beautiful blue swagger curtain in both of those portraits. The ermine, a lot of the elements that you see in the portraits downstairs of Napoleon, but they're slightly adapted. Napoleon, of course, isn't going to want to use that Bourbon symbol. He's going to want to come up with his own symbols. And we see that sort of in full order downstairs. And now we have Napoleon's coronation image. And as you can see, he's changed from a blue curtain to a red swagger curtain, but many of the elements are the same. It's that great big ermine-lined cloak, and there are bees and buzzing throughout the exhibition. And as I said, these symbols take on a meaning. As a self-made man, Napoleon is really trying to legitimize his reign, and so every single thing has a meaning. The first thing that happens when he proclaims himself emperor in 1804 is that he realizes he needs to get an arsenal of symbols, and all of his inner cabinet come up with a bunch of symbols, including the eagle, which you see on the top of the staff there. And that's a symbol of Roman military victory. The day that he proclaimed himself emperor, he ordered an eagle on top of every staff anywhere. So it was a firm symbol that everybody knew stood for Napoleon. He also crowned himself with a laurel wreath. That makes you think of Rome, you're right. It links back to Roman emperors. And when he proclaimed himself emperor, he took his crown, put it on Josephine, and put a laurel wreath on his own head. There are 300 bees that are emblazoned on the red mantle here, and they're also on the carpet. Bees were a symbol that were linking him to the first kings of France, the Merovingians. The tomb of Childeric I was unearthed in about 1653, and inside that tomb were these golden ingots or bees. Many people say that they were probably locusts, but whoever looked at them that day interpreted them as bees, and Napoleon thought, that's going to link me to the first kings of France. That's a great symbol to have and to use. So that's why we have bees everywhere throughout the empire. There's the hand of justice that relates to Charlemagne, who was a former emperor, something that Napoleon would have dispensed on his patrons who came in to see him. And again, the portrait's just dripping with these symbols. But the fashions quickly changed from the reign of the Bourbon monarchy, from Louis and Marie Antoinette to Napoleon. And there was a revolution in between and a lot of upheaval and many beheadings. So just to kind of chronicle in a funny way, because I love caricature, the excesses of those fashions between the 18th century, so the reign of Marie Antoinette and Louis, to sort of the revolutionary period on the right. This is one of my absolutely favorite caricatures of all time. It's Chloe's cushion, or the cork rump. So for those of you who have dogs, you can take your dog. The cork rump was stiff enough that your dog could have probably spent some time back there and ridden. And the towering hairstyles were so excessive that many women would knock into chandeliers because they were so unsteady on their feet. And because they had so much grease in their hair, they would often catch on fire and it just burned. So Napoleon was trying to steer away from that court excess because that was a look that was associated with aristocracy, with the Marie Antoinette and the French court before him, and so he's going to go in the absolute opposite direction. They're going to go for restraint, for simplicity, and they take off all of those undergarments, all the hoops and the stays and the corsets, and there's not a whole lot left. So on the right is a caricature of the Graces in a high wind, and this is Revolutionary period dress. So we're not yet to Napoleon, but it's kind of in that period between the Revolution and and Napoleon. And it's a muslin cloth that they're wearing. It's very thin, and they're obviously that's in a high wind, and you can see everything beneath the dress. But it was completely going the opposite direction. As we know, the pendulum always swings with fashion and in many other things, so that's where we go. And men, just in case you're feeling left out, we have the excesses of men from the 18th century, kind of the reign of Louis XVI rather, to kind of that revolutionary fashion going to the Directoire period of a gentleman known as the incroyable. The excessive man on the left was known as a macaroni. So you know that tune, Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. Well, that is when he stuck a feather in its cap and called it macaroni. So the hairstyle of these men often curled around, and they were very tight breeches that were sort of from Italy, and the style here is completely excess all the way. And this is not really a toned down version, but it's sort of the opposite, very unkempt, oversized collar, a looking glass, myopic vision. This is just in case the not so veiled threat of a wooden stick, because we're in the Revolution period almost. And it's again, the fashions are heading in a different direction. So there are a few half steps along the way that get us to where we need to go and where we will go. And one of those really comes in the form of Marie Antoinette. These are two portraits done in the same year by Vigée-Lebrun. Many of you, of course, know that we've got a beautiful portrait by Vigée-Lebrun in the collections. This is from 1783, and you see on the left her in this style of court dress that we saw a few images ago, wearing a corset and a stay and appearing like she would have appeared at court. But on the right, this image of her by Vigée-Lebrun was absolutely radical. She's taken off her undergarments, and she basically is wearing what is akin to a slip. It's a chemise, a very thin, see-through garment. And it was so radical because you could see her shadow through the skirt, which was completely unheard of at the time. She still has powdered hair, but it's not as done up as this hair on the left. But we're getting there. We're heading towards simplicity. We have a period of revolutionary fashion that, of course, corresponds to the years of the Revolution, 1789 to 99. And many of these clothes and outfits are very patriotic. So you've got the colors of the French Republic, red, white, and blue here. You've got the sans-culottes, the revolutionaries here. And then we get to a period known as the Directoire fashion, 1775 to 1799. It is really sort of, again, heading to that idea of looking back at Rome, and it's really kind of the triumph of undress. Literally, if you can see that the layers so thin right here, you can see her bare chest. The dress is very, very low, and then just this area in front called the fichu that covers, but not clearly all the way. It's possible this portrait of a young woman might be a woman named Madame Hamelin, and during the Directoire, fashions were very light cotton and linen, different shades of white, and again, this idea of sensual transparency that bring women toward a revealing level never before seen. But Madame Hamelin was known to often have worn these outfits that revealed her chest, and apparently on one occasion she was exiting her carriage wearing a Roman tunic knotted only on one shoulder with her breast out for all to see, and she had to retreat to her carriage to escape stones being thrown at her. Many of the fabrics that women are wearing at this point, the sheer fabrics, the muslins, are coming from India, which is the muslin was a precious and indispensable material, triumphed in Paris. it was sort of serving as this dual symbol of both comfort and luxury. So you've gotten rid of those stays, much more comfortable, but it's also a very luxurious fabric. And during this period, Josephine was also known for her level of undress. And of course, the British are quick to caricature and lambaste anything to do with the French. And here they are in this wonderful caricature by James Gilray that is either Madame Tallien, her friend, or the Empress herself, dancing naked before Barras in the winter of 1797. And this presents a problem for a woman who's on her way to becoming an empress. How do we reshape her image and construct it as someone who's going to be a head of state? And fashion is really going to serve in that role to help her essentially refashion her identity. This is also the period of the merveilleuse and the incroyable. We saw the incroyable before. The merveilleuse is just the female counterpart to that with the excessive styles of dress, large hats, wild hair, dressing like a Roman statue. The next period of dress is the consulate period, and this dovetails with Napoleon's rise to first consul, so 1799 to 1804, before he becomes emperor in 1804. This dress period was similar to the Directoire period, but it is, she's also wearing a very light dress, light fabric that's see-through. You can see the silhouette of her leg down here at the bottom. And interestingly, they mandated it was 2 inches above the belt that the fabric could not exceed. I can't even imagine. They were compacted in that dress, just 2 inches above. Not bearing breasts as in the consulate, but almost. It was a dress that they wore year-round, and I can't even imagine in winter weather what they would have done to stay warm. Many of them got what was called the muslin disease, which was a disease, and then sometimes they would even soak the muslin to make it look even more wet. So it was essentially a recipe for pneumonia. So I mentioned that fashion was really a tool that was going to be useful for Josephine to start to reshape her image and get it in line with a woman of state. There are a few caricatures that appear at this point, including this anonymous one of Madame Bonaparte drawing a portrait of first consul from 1801 to 1804, so before she becomes the empress. She's not known to have had these skills necessarily, and so it really was an attempt to make her appear patriarchal, make her appear that she had devotion and was more befitting of a woman who was going to be in a major role. She's obviously much more modestly attired as well. So fashion, again, the British, here they are, they really realize what a degree it's playing in reshaping Josephine's identity. She starts out, as we see, we kind of follow her progression from a plantation daughter. She was the daughter of a sugar planter in Martinique, and then we see her kind of go through a French countess, a widow, a prisoner, all the way through a mistress, finally to empress. And each role is a different outfit, and how fashion really plays that role in shaping her identity. Another element that helped to shape identity was her couturier, Louis Hippolyte Leroy. And he was among the most talked about designers. The name of Leroy is on everybody's lips. This is a quote from the period. He was the most talked about marchand de mode, so not only did he design the clothes, but he also sold them. And he was the leading authority on fashion. He was famous for having sold, he made and sold the costumes of the coronation based on designs by artists. He was vain and ambitious and ridiculed by many people. He was nevertheless indispensable and truly the controller of female fashion. He was the son of a machinist of the opera, but he started his career as a hairdresser for the Bourbon household in the Ancien Regime, and he understood that Napoleon wanted to stop the outrageous fashions of the Directoire and helped to steer towards a more respectable style. He was really known for creating these amazing bodices, and here we have an example on the right. He was a master of promotion, and to ensure that his name was repeatedly mentioned in all the fashion magazines, we have to think This is really the dawn of the whole era of the fashion magazines. After the revolution, when fashions were sort of halted, and there was now a newfound freedom, a number of these magazines came to circulate in France, essentially dictating what fashions that men and women could wear. Among the most well-known was the Journal des Dames et des Modes. Napoleon did not like Le Roi. He knew that Josephine overspent her clothing allowance with him every month. But he knew that Josephine really depended on him, and so for that reason, he kept him as one of the leading couturiers for the household. One of the other elements of fashion that helped to kind of achieve a level of decorum, so not only are we looking at prints of Josephine in roles showing patriarchal admiration, but we're starting to see the evolution of the shawl. And so no longer is it appropriate for women to go outside, as the woman on the left is during the consulate period, with her arms bare and with her throat bare. But you start to see shawls and veils that are coming back. And the Journal des Dames is right there to show you exactly the latest way to wear them. This is a dress that Josephine actually had made of a shawl itself, so it's kind of a double shawl within a shawl. So the dress is sewn with shawls, and then she's wearing a shawl. She was one of the first to receive one of the exotic shawls that Napoleon and his men discovered in Egypt during his campaigns from 1798 to 1801. And initially, she wasn't really crazy about them. She wrote to her son, Eugene, that in a letter, P.S., I have received the shawls. They may be very costly, but I think rather ugly. Their chief merit is the lightness of their texture. I doubt whether the fashion will take. Well, she was wrong. She had 150 shawls, all extremely beautiful and all high-priced. She eventually would send designs to Constantinople, and the shawls made after these patterns were as beautiful as they were valuable. And this gets her into trouble a little bit because the British control the East Indies and other areas, and these are all these imports that are coming in. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But Napoleon is going to be right there at every step, encouraging the production of native French shawls. He commissions the artist Jean-Baptiste Isabey to make designs of a woolen stuff like cashmere, but it's not the same. Not all the same. So we're ramping up toward Napoleon becoming first consul and a real shift in his role in dictating fashion and shaping it through the rest of the empire. So Napoleon is 3 consuls, part of a team of 3 people, with Cambyses on the left, Napoleon in the middle, and Lebrun on the right. And this is 1799. He came to power as first consul. And at this point, the fashions for women were using cotton and other materials that were not produced in France. They were imported either from the Americas or from the British-controlled territories, such as India. And in the year 1798 to 99, so right before he comes as first consul, the import of raw materials such as cotton, wool, hemp, flax, and so on was 96 million. By 1799, the year he became first consul, it had increased to 133 million. So industry was just happening everywhere except France. And they were importing everything into their country rather than producing it themselves. So one of the first things that he does when he comes to power as the 3 consuls is to reintroduce uniforms and costume for all officials and dignitaries. This provides work for all the manufacturers in France, like Lyon and Gobelin and many other manufacturers. And it's a fabric by decree. So he actually makes a law, a senatorial decree that states that every single person, not only in the household, but members of the Senate, teachers, anybody in a public position has to wear a state-designed outfit. And not only do they have to wear it in the winter, they have to have a different one for the spring, for the summer. It becomes a very costly thing to do to keep up with appearances at court. And they distribute a program that tells how everybody has to dress. And those programs are not only issued from the court themselves, but you see them showing up in fashion magazines like the Journal des Dames. And he's trying to reinstate elegance at his court. So here we have with women, it's a return to bringing back veils and lace. Everybody in his household had a certain color that was assigned to their outfits. We have in the exhibition downstairs one example of a coat that was worn by the Grand Master of the Hunt. It's green, so anybody in that officer unit would have worn a green coat. And the idea behind assigning a color for each division and each officer and each member of the household was so that you could tell at a distance what their rank was, what level they were, what their station was, and it comes completely out of this military tradition that Napoleon knew. Napoleon changed court costumes 3 times. So not only did you have to wear them in the summer, in the spring, and the winter, he completely changed them during the course of his reign. And again, many of his courtiers would complain about how much they had to spend on these outfits to just maintain this look. But Napoleon had a double agenda in mind. He was trying to bolster that French economy. So I've mentioned the Journal de Dames and de Mode a couple of times. This really was the primary journal through which women and men saw fashions. They were disseminated in this weekly publication. It ran from 1797 to 1839. 2 individuals, Jean-Baptiste Selec and Pierre de Messenière, started it. And they started reporting on the world of fashion and culture along with all of these images of fashion. It lasted 42 years. Selec was a professor of rhetoric during the Revolution, but he lost his job and came to Paris at age 29. He became a bookseller and wrote articles for newspapers in order to make a living. De la Messenière was born into a well-off, highly respected family which owned various estates and farms. He took holy orders in 1784 after finishing his education, so here's the ex-priest. In 1786, he was ordained as a priest and became the incumbent of the chapel of Saint-Jean. After a few years, he became a professor at a college for young gentlemen, teaching philosophy, literature, and rhetoric. In 1793, after the decision by the Revolutionary Committee to suppress all religious institutions, he was forced into anonymity and moved to Paris, where he took up writing until the founding of the Journal de Dames et de Mode. He cultivated a passion for high-quality, hand-colored prints and had all talents for a fashion editor. Talent as a writer and journalist, a philosophical approach to the history of costume, a natural ability regarding fashion and elegance, and a highly developed sense of business. So in a society where power was money, it was no longer linked to class. It was really a propitious moment. So we've seen a few examples of Napoleon's officers and the last plates of some of the court dress that was presentation dress. Now on to their actual coronation dress themselves. So as I mentioned, Napoleon's grand costume was packed with symbols: the laurel wreath, the Rome, the symbol of imperial victory with the eagle, the bees, many elements that combine to really show that he is there by right. Even though it's not hereditary right, he has linked himself through these symbols to really show you that he is legitimate as an emperor. He has an ample crimson and velvet imperial robe, the grand manteau in the red of imperial Rome. As I mentioned, it's specked with gold bees and mythic motifs that come from a Romanized tradition. So there are sprigs of laurel, and it's tough to see here, but you can see it downstairs in the portrait. Olive and oak leaves surrounding the N that's embroidered on his chair. In no other court were there more symbols than in the Napoleon court. It might not have been the largest court. There were 3,500 members of his household, but it was certainly the most sumptuous and the most dripping with symbols. His cloak is lined with ermine and worn open at the left shoulder. So it's hard to see here, but it was actually a one-shoulder cloak, which was different than what Josephine wore, and I'll get into that when I talk about her costume. Underneath, he has a long white satin tunic. And again, this idea of dressing, the colors were really, you see a lot of red and white, a white solid dress with red over mantle, and that does link, women look like statues or Roman columns. So Josephine's coronation costume was designed by Jean-Baptiste Isabey. in consultation with advisors and fabricated by Leroy, as I mentioned earlier, who was the leading marchand de mode of the day. And scholars really credit Josephine with influencing its design. The modernity of her coronation dress is most evident in its conformity to the high-waisted silhouette. So again, we have that, what we now know as the empire waist. It's this high-waisted silhouette of the sort of a neo-Greek dress. And the skirt falls continuously from that waist. So it's unlike what we had in the previous moment. So it's completely a departure from what we had in the previous period during Marie Antoinette in the 18th century. In contrast to this open robe that divided over a petticoat, as we see on the left. And her collar, and it is tough to see there, but it's based on the idea, she's got a standing collar on that's here, it doesn't lay down flat. And that really takes us back to the Medici collar that was worn by Queen Marie de Medici. So again, she's trying also to link back to these former monarchs to legitimize her place as well. The white color of her coronation dress conformed to the dominant neoclassical taste, although the change of fabric from a lightweight cotton muslin that we saw earlier, that see-through fabric, to a heavy silk satin brocade had strong revivalist associations. Not only had ivory and cream-colored satins come into favor at Versailles toward the end of the Ancien Regime, but the reversion to silk was politically symbolic and intended to support the Lyon silk manufacturers, who had been catastrophically affected by the revolution. Napoleon reinstated traditional protectionist economic policies, banning the importation of Indian muslin during the consulate and decreeing in 1804 that silk manufactured in France was mandatory for court costumes. Her hairstyle, Josephine's, was also up to date. It's not powdered anymore, so again, we're completely heading away from the excesses of the French court with Marie Antoinette. It's a close-fitting style, perpetuating a reaction against the wigs and powdered hair that we had seen previously. Her slippers are amazing. The white taffeta slippers designed for the coronation imitated an antique style known as the coturne, which crossed lacings up the leg. These flat shoes were another feature of contemporary fashion. They replaced high heels that were sort of de rigueur in the 1790s, provoking some controversy about their resemblance to men's shoes. So she gets the B's too. They're right there. They look actually pretty comfortable. So the reason she needed such comfortable shoes is she was hauling a massive train of velvet. Here we see her in her toilette getting ready to go to the coronation, and her ladies-in-waiting are helping her put on these straps, so they would have looked like that. And they're fastening that on for her to get ready to walk down to become empress. Just a few facts and figures. She had 22 meters of velvet in her coronation robe, and the cost for velvet at that moment was 614 francs, which is equivalent roughly to $135,000 today. The cost for the ermine lining and embroidered border, 12,460 francs, which is equivalent to $2.7 million. And the weight of it was 80 pounds. Initially, her design was to be just like Napoleon's and wear it over one shoulder. However, because it was 80 pounds, she couldn't support that weight, and they had to change the design to be over two shoulders. And it's also no wonder she's sitting down in many of her portraits. So we see here, this is the great coronation portrait at the Louvre. It's massive in scale. If you're ever there, just spend some time in front of it. And just a detail at the right of all of the princesses who are needing to help carry that robe of 80 pounds. I read some reports that they didn't really like Josephine, and I had read that they tried to trip her on the way up to the altar. So that image I show you earlier is actually from this coronation mantle, or this mantle rather, worn at court. And not only was dress being regulated for all members of the court, but also people who would have attended court and been presented to Napoleon and Josephine. This particular court train is said to have been worn by Armandine Marie Georgine de Sorrent at Napoleon's marriage to Marie Louise in 1810. In 1808, The wearer had married the Prince de Lion, chamberlain to the emperor, and this costume closely follows the etiquette for ladies at court, as established by the designs of the painter Jean-Baptiste Isabey for Napoleon's coronation as emperor in 1804. The heavy train hangs from shoulder straps, and it is secured at the front with a belt. She also has a standing lace collar, although different than Napoleon or than Josephine's. It's not flat against her body. She was wearing embroidery that also follows the regulations set down in 1804. And the border, and this is really interesting, the border along the edge does not exceed 4 inches, which is a width that was prescribed for a woman who was neither a princess of the empire nor a close female relative of the emperor or empress. I mean, this is down to the letter, that they are really mandating that court dress and what you can and cannot wear. So looking and thinking about fashion as a product of agriculture and industry, I've talked a little bit about cotton and many other fabrics coming from outside of France, and that's really going to start to have an impact on how Napoleon's thinking and how he's going to address that when he is emperor. Textile production was an important part of France's economy. It was important to control not just what was worn, but also the materials used for manufacture of clothes, including the quantities and origins of these fabrics. In addition, the complexity of manufacture of the finished items and the location of these skills were the key factors in the country's economy. So just a couple of things that he was thinking about. So insects produce silk, among other things. Plants produce cotton, as well as hemp and linen. And animals give skins, wool, fur, and hair. And so some of the things that were fashionable, he was thinking, well, maybe we can grow them here, or maybe we can find a way to get them here and bolster our own economy. Again, thinking about France on the heels of the revolution, the economy was decimated, so he really needed to try to revive and rebuild that native industry. Among those industries was the Lyon silk manufacturers. Before the French Revolution, Lyon had 15,000 looms for the manufacture of silk. But by 1814, there were still only 8,000. The revolution and the resulting use of more common fabrics, like cotton or muslin, had caused an enormous drop in the demand for silk production. By the time Napoleon came to power in 1804, from the original 2,700 makers of gauze and veils in Lyon, only 400 remained. So that's quite a drop. Similarly, the number of lace makers had gone from 2,700 to 300, and embroiderers from 6,000 to 600. So one of the ways that Napoleon became aware of the latest and greatest inventions were through the format of an exhibition of French industrial products, such as the Exposition Publique des Produits of the Industry of France. The inaugural exhibition was in 1798, and Napoleon promoted industry and markets via his own exhibitions of 1801, 1802, 1806. And it was in that 1806 exhibition that there were 1,422 exhibitors representing 104 of the departments of France. This idea was so successful, it was later copied by Britain in their World's Fair, the Great Exhibition, rather, of 1851, and then the World's Fairs in the United States. But we're 50 years earlier than that in France, so at the beginning of the century. Napoleon's aim was to empower the French industry to make it equal or superior to the productive power of all other nations. Among the exhibitors at the 1801 exhibition was Joseph-Marie Jacquard, and he designed the weaving loom, known as the Jacquard loom. It was the first machine to use punched cards to control a series of sequences, a key step in the development of computer programming. His invention was an attachment that sat on top of the loom, so you see it up here, where a series of cards with holes punched in them would rotate through the device. Each hole in the card corresponded with a specific hook on the loom, so it served as a command to raise and lower the hook. The position of the hook dictated the pattern of the raised and lowered threads, allowing textiles to repeat complex patterns with great speed and precision. It was very controversial, however, because it was fiercely opposed by the silk weavers, who had feared that its introduction would save labor and deprive them of their livelihood. However, the loom's advantages secured its general adoption, and by 1812, there were over 11,000 looms used in France. It was declared public property in 1806, and Jacquard was awarded with a pension and a royalty on each machine. Another product that Napoleon was trying to bolster, and an individual that he became very close to for industrial purposes, was Christophe Philippe Oberkampf, and it was Oberkampf's Toile de Juillet. Oberkampf was a French naturalized German industrialist and became famous for founding the royal manufacturer of printed cottons of Juillet, where the toile was manufactured. He was born in Germany into a family of dyers. He traveled to educate himself and initially worked as an engraver, and then in Paris as a colorist for fabrics. With demand for linen falling, because of the preference for cotton, it was clearly time for some action from the emperor to promote the use of linen in the manufacture of clothes. Oberkampf got a gold medal in 1806, and Napoleon visited his factory in akin to a publicity stunt with Josephine. And he said, "What, you don't have the Cross of the Legion?" And Oberkampf replied, "No, sir, I do not." And Napoleon reportedly took off his own and pinned it on him, and they became very close. So war is also going to have an impact, and probably the most decisive impact on fashion and trade, of course. The background image is showing the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October, 1805. It was Nelson's crushing defeat of the French and Spanish navies, and it established Britain as the dominant world naval power for a century, but at the cost of Nelson's life. Colonial trade had been an important part of the French economy. Martinique, Guadeloupe, Tobago, San Domingo normally traded through Bordeaux. Nantes and Le Havre were bringing in sugar, coffee, cotton, and indigo, and exporting flour, salted beef, and manufactured products. With the revolution in France, revolts in the colonies, and warfare on land, and blockades at sea, the French colonies were no longer a reliable source of imports or exports. Britain, by contrast, dominated the seas and relied strongly on trade with its colonies and with the East. As Napoleon's influence spread across Europe, Britain stood foremost in opposition and in competition to the might of France. Even before Napoleon came to power, his campaign in Egypt was inspired by a desire to damage or take over their trade in India and in the East. After the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 and the destruction of the French fleet, it was impossible to consider an invasion of Britain. Napoleon realized the only way of combating the British was through commerce. He recognized England's strength at sea, saying, quote, "You must never lose sight of the fact that if English commerce triumphs at sea, it is because they are stronger there. It is then right and proper that since France is the stronger by land, she should make her commerce triumph there, without which all is lost." Whoops. So if we think about France and the maps I have here of British control and French control, Napoleon really believed that France needed to and had the right to dominate European trade. So the Netherlands, Switzerland, and parts of Germany were subservient to France and Italy, which had very little industrialization, but was a good source for silk and other raw materials. They were all a ready market for French finished products. In fashion, however, the most popular materials were cotton-based. The names of some of these fabrics really tell you where they're from. We have calico from India, chintz, which is a Sanskrit word meaning colored or spotted, also from India, madras, another fabric from India, muslin from Iraq, nankeen, which was often used for breeches, was from China, and percale was a Persian word for rag, and it came from Persia. So all of these fabrics that were important to French fashion were from outside of France. And to make matters worse, they were produced in territories that were controlled by the British. And the only solution, according to Napoleon, was the following: find a way to produce cotton in France or in the empire, remove the demand for cotton products, or, and this is what he ends up doing, block Britain from exporting their goods to Europe. Napoleon's actions were decisive. Quote, "Thus I naturalized in France the manufacture of cotton, which includes first spun cotton, We didn't previously spin it ourselves. The English supplied us with it as a sort of favor. The second, the fabric, we did not yet make it. It came to us from abroad. The printing of the fabric, this was the only part of the manufacture that we performed ourselves. I wished to naturalize the two first branches, and I proposed to the Council of State that their importation should be prohibited. This excited great alarm. I sent for Oberkampf, who made the toile, and I conversed with him a long time. I learned from him that this prohibition would doubtless produce a shock, but that after a year or two of perseverance, it would prove a triumph, whence we should derive immense advantages. And then I issued my decree, in spite of it all. This was a true piece of statesmanship. He really thought he was about to do something amazing. I confined myself merely to prohibiting the fabrics. I extended the prohibition to spun cotton, and we now possess within ourselves the three branches of the cotton manufacture to the great benefit of our population and the injury of the English. The image at the right is referencing the cotton industry of Richard Lenoir. The greatest efforts to produce cotton in France, by 1807, Richard Lenoir were cotton industrialists. By 1807, there were 12,000 cotton workers in Paris, with 60% working for one of the great industrialists, Richard Lenoir. By 1810, Richard Lenoir had 6 cotton spinning mills with 3,600 workers in Normandy. By 1814, there were 400,000 people employed in the manufacture of cotton in France, with 44 cotton mills in Paris alone. It would take a long time before France could match foreign imports in fineness of fibers, quality, and price. There were many high-quality woods and furs from abroad that were also popular. Alpaca from South America, cashmere from the shawls in India, merino wool from Spain, and there was a demand for ermine. All of these things were, again, coming from outside. Napoleon either had to accept that Britain would continue to dominate the market in Europe or find a way to close European markets from them. And he did so through something known as the Continental Blockade. In November of 1806, November 21st, Napoleon signed a decree ordering a blockade, which is the forcible closing of ports, to prevent Britain from trading and communicating with other European nations under French control. Goods were confiscated wherever found. The blockade also removed Britain's leading market share in Europe and allowed France to dominate. The other European countries were forced to export their raw materials to France and import French goods, forcing the whole economy of Europe to be subservient to French interests. Britain responds, of course, in caricature. The giant, this is a caricature by George Cruikshank, the giant commerce overwhelming the pygmy blockade. So they really thought it was a joke, in a way. The giant stands on Great Britain and a green strip of land, which is underneath his feet, hurling articles of British commerce across a narrow channel at Napoleon, whose head and shoulders project from a stone fortification. In any British caricature, Napoleon is always really, really dwarfed. But I told Mark Gerges that I'm a convert. Napoleon was actually 5'6½", so he really wasn't that short. But the British, of course, made him look extremely short. So we have the Colossus wool throwing things back at Napoleon. And his head is pottery. He's got a handle forming his ear. And a vessel shaped like a jockey cap is Wedgwood ware. The forehead is Staffordshire ware. And these things are all kind of spelled out on the caricature. 2 large saucers for his eyes. Derby porcelain. The nose is Worcestershire. The mouth or teeth is porcelain. He stands with his legs astride and arms extended. The bulky body is wool. The sleeves are printed calico. So all the things that Napoleon is banning, they're making a mockery of. And this is an actual picture of a battle of Bayonne in December of 1810. But 4 years earlier, the same site, the ports, became a site of drama between the French and the English. And the English seized a number of goods. They seized by agents of the customs, and they were burned and destroyed at the port of the city, all these English goods. There were 344 parts of percale, a number of bolts of cotton, velvet muslin, nankeen, wool, etc. They were burned or broken publicly in the public square of the city. So the blockade, even though it had moments like this where Napoleon felt that he was triumphing, it really was less successful than he had hoped. The predictable British retaliation removed all regular supplies from overseas of every product, not just fabrics, including those that had no adequate substitution in Europe. And most of the immediate effects were felt with things like coffee, sugar, and dye. And I don't know if there are any coffee drinkers out there, but chicory does not cut it. And that is what they used to substitute for coffee. Napoleon set up several factories to make sugar from the newly discovered source of beets, and woven matter were used to replace indigo and cochineal. But the effect on the western ports of France was a disaster. The export markets of hemp, flour, and finished products to the Americas were lost, and whatever merchant ships were on the seas were at constant risk of seizure by both sides of the conflict, using either the regular navy or licensed privateers. The levels of smuggling increased rapidly and on an enormous scale. So that brings us back to fashion and to Louis Le Roy. He was not only the couturier to Josephine, but to many other courts across Europe. And so he really wasn't going to abide by the strict regulation and rules that he couldn't import these banned items. In this particular illustration, white satin dresses, a muff of Barbary goatskin at the left, here, and center, and then a dress of muslin and a muff of bearskin at the right. None of these things were things that were native to France, but they were sumptuous items that Leroy's patrons wanted, and so he found a way to bring them in. And Napoleon, recognizing that tremendous profits could be earned from the French-made versions of these shawls, ordered French merchants to convert their spinning mills to Oriental-style designs. So we see these illustrations again appearing all the time in the Dame de Mode, the fashion magazines. When Napoleon became emperor, he set up factories that offered to Parisian and provincial customers shawls in cotton or any other fabric at reduced prices. Shawls for winter were made of vicuna and had gold tassels. In the summer, they were sometimes made of crimson percale. The manner of wearing a shawl over the head like a scarf, rolled around your neck or about the shoulders, was very important. It signified one's position in the hierarchy of the day and represented a way of life that had more to do with morals than with clothing. We see a number of examples of shawls in the exhibition. I love this portrait on the left. This is a bit of a detail, but this was in a private collection in France, and when it was negotiated for the exhibition, the family said, well, do you like shawls? And they went back and they got the actual shawl that she's wearing in the portrait, and it's in the exhibition. So I encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, please go down there. But once you realize how important shawls were as a component of fashion during that period, you see them everywhere. They're in this beautiful portrait by David at the end of these two sisters, Napoleon's nieces, and they show up again and again and again. And because fabric is so important to understanding the empire and Napoleon's reign, one of the interactives that we have is that we've actually sourced period fabric from France, and the museum guides are offering a guided tour on the evenings and weekends where you can actually feel these fabrics. You can feel a shawl from the period. You can feel silk taffeta and French silk cut velvet. So again, if you haven't done it already, I would encourage you to do so. So again, we kind of have come full circle with fashion playing an important role. From the excesses at the beginning of the end of the Revolution and Marie Antoinette to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum with the revealing, throwing out of the stays, and the men going from the dandy on the left, the macaroni, to the incroyable, to then a more regimented and elegant level of dress in Napoleon's court. And we have to thank an ex-priest, an ex-hairdresser, and a Corsican immigrant. Thank you very much.